I have saved this subsection until last because it's complex and needs extra attention. Ever since Whitley Strieber wrote about his encounters with the Greys decades ago, this species has popped up ever so often in the UFO literature, often described as a malevolent race, doing genetic experiments on humans without their consent. They have quite a bad reputation. Now, when we better understand who they are, we can also see that these beings have been part of Earth's mythology for hundreds of years. So let us take a look at this species a little closer and more objective than what is the norm. The original home planet of the Zeta Reticuli Greys was called Apex and was located in the Lyran star system. On Apex, a nuclear war destroyed most of its surface, and the inhabitants had to live underground for thousands of years. Due to radiation, their reproductive capacities were damaged so that cloning was the only way for the species to survive. Their bodies mutated and became those we now know as the Zeta Reticuli Greys. Before the nuclear war, the Apexians had already ecological problems. Just like we do here on Earth, they used negative energy for selfish purposes and polluted their planet. Then, on top of that, they were invaded and infiltrated by an alien race called the Verdants, originating from another galaxy some 14 million light-years from here. This invasion culminated in the nuclear war, and a faction of the Greys were captured and made into foot soldiers for the Verdants. The Verdant themselves were already then a very advanced race, reptilian in nature, looking a little bit like the Greys we are used to see. Apex, in the beginning, looked quite similar to Earth. It was a beautiful planet with lots of resources. Just like we humans, the inhabitants of Apex were a mix of different races due to that the early Lyrans had already started colonizing Sector 9. Apex, like so many other planets, was used for genetic engineering by these different creator god species from within the Lyran constellation. Hence, the inhabitants had also a generous mix of ideologies. Some worshipped technology, others rejected it. Some were warriors while others were peacebringers, and so on. However, due to a wide variety of ideologies, the gap between those who were choosing the path of technology and those who were more spiritual or closer to nature became bigger and bigger. Leading groups on the planet started using technology very destructively, just like we are beginning to do here on Earth, and the history of Apex could be a great study project for us here on this planet to learn what could be our destiny if we don't change our ways. They started polluting the planet without thinking the least about the consequences, and also began to use nuclear power destructively, exactly like we are doing as a human species. In addition, they have told humans that at least part of the reason why their planet became inhabitable was because of their overuse of electrogravity. However, there were those who were smarter and could see what was coming, so they started building underground facilities and shelters in case of a catastrophe, which they could foresee based on the direction in which things were going. According to Lissa Royal and her channeled messages from Germain, the Apexians did not realize, or simply just ignored the facts, that their nuclear experiments and misuse of technology had started breaking down the planetary energy field on a subquantum, subatomic level. This created an electromagnetic warp in the time-space fabric surrounding the planet. While the species were living underground, Apex changed its position in the time-space continuum because of the dramatic subquantum energy breakdown. Germain, Collective, through Lissa Royal, continues. Time and space is very much like Swiss cheese. A planet in one location is connected through a series of multidimensional networks or passageways to other areas of your galaxy. When this warp began around their planet, the planet was moved through the fabric of time-space to another time-space continuum, which was a significant distance from their point of origin.
You have labeled this area the Reticulum star group. The apex planet was inserted in the reticulum system around one of the faintest stars in that star group. This occurred simply because the planetary shift followed the fabric of time and space. The underground Apexians were totally unaware of this as they continued with their lives under the surface. They continued saving their species. Germain explains further that while the Apexians were living underground, without natural sunlight, they worked on restructuring their genetic setup so their bodies could more easily adapt to the new, inconvenient situation. So with time, they developed larger eyes with pupils that covered the whole cornea of the eyes, so they could absorb light on other frequencies to keep their bodies and minds functioning. They lost their reproduction organs due to that they didn't give natural birth anymore. They also lost their digestive tract atrophy because they were no longer eating solid food. Instead, they learned how to absorb nutrients through their skin. Because the nuclear disaster affected everybody on the planet, all kinds of diversity was going on underground, too. They seem to have one thing in common, though. After had pondered their new situation, they came to the conclusion that the reason for the catastrophe was the species' emotional side. Therefore, they agreed to take out the emotional part from their bio-mind, and thus became quite emotionless. To avoid a similar disastrous situation in the future, they started creating a neurochemical structure in which an outside stimulus would create the same reaction in all of them. This way, they felt they could integrate into one people and not let passion and emotions rule them into a downward spiral. Although they had now turned much into what we call a hive community, there were still different philosophies playing their part in their culture. Each faction had their own viewpoint on whom they were on a higher level of existence. Some of them became more benevolent than others. In our terms of thinking, although it was all about different viewpoints on how to best survive. As mentioned earlier, Apex was a big center for genetic engineering, and lots of experiments with different ET races were taking place there long before the nuclear war, making the surface uninhabitable. The Apexians, who eventually turned into the short grays, were, according to the Germain group, originally of a vegan humanoid biokind, and the mutations that happened due to the nuclear disaster is what changed their body type. On the other hand, they're talking about a second, not-so-humanoid-looking kind of vegans, who are more reptilian or insect-like in appearance, but still humanoid mammals with a copper base in skin and bloodstream, which also give them a slight greenish color. These would probably be the reptilian-humanoid hybrids the vegans created while on Earth during the dinosaur era, as discussed above. The Greys could very well have those genes mixed in as well. Genetic engineering is the game of the gods, and it is extremely common throughout the universe, even to the point that it seems to be a part of the evolutionary progress of a species to eventually become like the gods and start manipulating DNA to improve their own species, and as they get more advanced. While traveling through space-time, they also want to create new species on other worlds by either manipulating the DNA of creatures already living there, or create life on whole new worlds. Humans have already begun this process in secret laboratories and in huge facilities underground, such as the infamous Area 51 in Nevada. The creator gods are rarely making perfect products in their first attempts, and before they are satisfied, lots of beings of lesser perfection are created. Mostly, these failures are destroyed, but it depends on the creator gods. Sometimes they don't bother, and just leave the imperfect prototypes to their destiny. The former Apexians, today's Zeta Reticulians, are not the only types of Greys out there. In fact, several sources point out that the gray sauroid/reptilian type is not uncommon at all in the universe, even in other galaxies. However, the types of short grays that have interfered with us on Earth, or have been cited the most, are often the ones from the Zeta Reticuli 1 and 2 star systems, whose ancestors were the Apexians. Today, here on Earth, we have a quite misleading stereotype vision of who the Greys are, assuming they are all quite negative in nature. This is a common error we make. We have a tendency to categorize alien species to fit into one box or the other, bad aliens and good aliens. I've pointed this out before, but we'll do it again because of its importance. We need to stop categorizing ET races in the above manner. It is very misleading. It is true that we humans have had some very disturbing experiences with the Greys, but this is only from certain groups of them. Not all of them are like that. This goes for other races as well. No race is purely evil or purely good. There are all shades of gray in between, no pun intended. With that said, let's continue with the story. There is a faction of the Greys that for one has more Lyran genes in them, which means they are more warrior-like and are striving to gain power. Another faction is more spiritual in general and don't interfere with us in a negative way, if at all. Some of them can even be very loving, although some of these Greys are almost certainly from elsewhere, aside from Zeta Reticuli. There are also other former apex Greys who have a slightly different body structure than the one we are most familiar with. So, even if many of the Greys we have learned about here on Earth may act and look different from each other, many of them have the same origins. After many generations, the underground Greys considered it relatively safe to return to the surface of the planet again. They were quite shocked when they noticed a totally different sky scenario. The stars looked very different from what they were used to. The constellations were different, and also, it was not the same sun. It slowly sank into their minds that their planet was no longer in the same solar system as before they went underground. They had no clue where they were, and it took them quite some time to figure out that their new home was now in the Zeta Reticuli system. Due to what had happened with Apex traveling through a wormhole, the Greys learned about folding space and how to use wormholes, stargates, and black holes for space travel. This new reality also brought their different factions together in attempts to understand their situation, and they were united in spirit, at least for a while. Even though they had lived underground for many generations, the species had kept their technological knowledge intact, and they still knew how to space travel. They started building spaceships again and began to explore their new star system and populated some of the planets around Zeta Reticuli 1 and 2. Eventually, a more self-serving group broke out and left the star system to explore other worlds and other parts of the universe. Some of them ended up in the Orion system, while others went to the Sirius Trinary system. Some who have experienced abductions by the Greys, and channelers and researchers say that a faction of the Greys from Zeta Reticuli are working together with the reptilians from Orion and once became their inferior, or foot soldiers. Others, like author, contactee, and researcher George Lobueno on the other hand, are convinced the main faction of the robotic Greys work with the Verdants, a distant race who is here on a not-so-benevolent mission. Personally, I think it's a mix of both and more. It could also very well be that the Greys that have appeared during abductions where the Anunnaki are the main abductors could have been there because they have a treaty with the Orion Reptilians, whom in their turn work with the Anunnaki. This means that the Greys may not work directly with the Nibiruans, but have been present because of the Orions. The Greys, at one point in time, started to evolve and explore space, and like many newly evolved species, they experimented with electrogravity, which brought the attention to many other galactic and intergalactic species due to the potential danger in doing so. Used in an inappropriate way, electrogravity may not only lessen the longevity of the Sun and its solar system, but the galaxy and the universe as a whole. Of course, this draws attention from many concerned races who are much more advanced and have a full grasp of this problem with young civilizations. It's like parents who left their young adolescents alone and now have to correct them. The Apexian Greys, using electrogravity negatively, like we humans are now, were at the same time spotted by the Verdants, who are an intergalactic conquering race, very much like the Lyrans used to be, but are expanding their empire outside their own galaxy. The verdants infiltrated the Apexian government, and the interaction between the two cultures eventually led to the destruction of Apex, according to Lobuono. It's unclear to me when the following happened. But either when the Apexians were still living on Apex, or when their planet had moved to Zeta Reticuli, the verdants started abducting them in large quantities and conducted genetic experiments on them, making them less emotional to be used as their front soldiers, while the verdants themselves were hiding behind them in the background, making the Greys scapegoats for further manipulation of races and genetic engineering of new species, similar to that which we see today here on Earth. The Orion reptilians are millions, and the verdants probably billions, of years ahead of us in the evolution. They know how to put up screen memories to manipulate the abductees, including using soul traps, which makes it nearly impossible to penetrate the real memories behind the memory shield. Hence, the verdants, for example, when abducting people, can implant false memories, blaming reptilians for the abduction and vice versa. I think this happens a lot. We tend to forget about those things, having some kind of delusive conception, not realizing how far ahead of us these races are. Humanity, in comparison, are small children who are just learning to crawl. Still, we think we understand what ETs can and can't do. George Lobuono, in his excellent book, Alien Mind, at least gives us a clue. One thing most researchers, including myself, are quite certain about is that the Greys can no longer mass produce, and they even seem to lack sex organs, and instead use cloning to expand the number of individuals. Some of them, probably, also lack souls. In other words, they are onto cybernetic. Others believe that the Greys are time travelers, and thus are us in the future, coming back to their own past, perhaps just like the Pleiadians, trying to change us, so we can change the timeline which led to the society these species live within in the future. One thing does not exclude the other, though. We are creating different timelines continuously with our thoughts and emotions. And on one of them we may have let the verdants and the Greys succeed with completely, or nearly completely, manipulate our DNA/RNA to such a degree that we become like them. A similar thing may have happened in terms of the Pleiadians. Both these species may therefore have come back to our time, trying to change their own present, our future. But why now? It is because of the nanosecond, the term coined by the Pleiadians. The nanosecond is when timelines merge, partly due to our alignment with the galactic center, which changes our DNA, and many of us become truly and consciously multidimensional. The second meaning is that of the word nanosecond itself. Nano means extremely small or 1/1,000,000th. A nanosecond in that sense would mean a billionth of a second, referring to the time frame of 1987 to 2012 in relation to the age of the universe. In other words, these 25 years is like a nanosecond in the cycle of the universe. On the other hand, the Pleiadians are talking about the machine kingdom based on nanotechnology, and there we have the word nano again. This is the big challenge we have in front of us. Are we going to stop relying so much on technology and start trusting our internet? Or are we going to let nanotechnology take us to places where most of us don't want to go, which includes cloning of humans, genetic manipulation of our species, in combination with negative use of electrogravity, creation of androids, making humans into onto cybernetics, robots/machines, and in the process we lose our souls and our sexual ability to mass produce. Today, many people are laughing at such a science fiction-like future, but it is very real and it is already starting to happen, rapidly. I have posted quite a few articles on my old blog, News from Behind the Scenes, and these articles are not part of some weird conspiracy theory. They are posted in highly scientific papers and websites, or in mainstream media. The Pleiadians are very clear with that they are here to help us make a rational decision for our future. By informing us about our choices, enough of us will make decisions which will not lead into an irreversible trap. We don't want to end up like the Greys. At this point in time, the Greys can be seen as catalysts for us humans. If we do what they did, we end up like them. If we avoid the traps they stepped into as a younger species, we may survive. As that, reasons listed by us humans as of why some Greys are abducting humans is long. We have already mentioned one plausible reason: genetic manipulation to make our species non-sexual like them. This is something we will discuss more in depth in a later paper about the verdants and the greys, but this is definitely happening. Others say that the greys want to be able to reproduce like us instead of having to clone themselves. Just like when you make copies of a copy on the copy machine and continually make copies out of these copies, eventually the quality will decrease until it's unreadable. It's the same with cloning. The bodies will degenerate after so many cloning attempts. The bodies will not be good enough to carry a soul, and eventually cloning won't work at all anymore. Some say this is where the greys are at now, and the reason they abduct humans is to collect their DNA and even let human women carry their fetuses, in hope to be able to create a body type strong enough to be a soul carrier. Again, both options could be correct, depending on which faction of the greys we are dealing with at a particular time. Those who work for the verdants may have their agenda, while others, who are free from verdant influence, may try to find a way back to their old lives as a sexually reproducing species. All in all, I think many greys have received a bad, undeserved reputation. With that said, I don't mean we should go out and mingle with all the greys we may see, but just as an observation after have studied the subject. I also think they have been ruthlessly used and taken advantage of to become slave species for other ET groups. Like I mentioned briefly above, there are those who have seen them together with the Anunnaki as well. Which brings us right to the subject of the next paper.